Did you know that many students in the same classroom, in the same school, perceive their schooling experiences differently? Welcome to our listeners in the North, South, East, and West. We are Educa K16 podcast, bringing distinguished guests in education. We are a call to action to raise awareness about education in our nation, calling for what my distinguished co-host, Dr. Noboa, calls a renaissance in our school system. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Pinkos, whose professional journey started back in 1984 as an elementary school teacher, and her trajectory includes service as a school principal and district level executive. We ask you listeners to please listen with love and stay in the now with Educa K16. Shout outs to Jose Carlos from Bottles, our post-production. We couldn't do it without him. And to DTO Music for our jingle, Arterezone for our branding. I quote my co-host, Dr. Noboa, knowledge through language is what facilitates the integration of multiple modes of understanding, as well as guide the navigation of countless cognitive connections in the interface of learning, language, and culture. Any disruption to the process is bound to limit the full potential of the learner. Welcome, Dr. Noboa. Welcome to my co-host. How are you today?
Thank you. Good to be back. And let me add to your introduction. Dr. Margarita Pinkos, recently retired just earlier this very year, 2021, as a high-level administrator in the West Palm Beach public school system, and is now president of an association called NABE, which represents the National Association for Bilingual Education. For those of you that have been following our podcast, we have used that acronym before, but we cannot take it for granted. And so we are ready to interview her as a special guest, and it's an honor to have her here. So let me turn it back to Sandra.
I want to say a little bit more about you, Dr. Noboa, if it's okay. I want our new listeners to know that you are the author of the two most recent books in the nation about Latinos in education and American history and the critical issues we face in the 21st century. So, Dr. Noboa, our audience is eager to get started with this interview.
Thank you.
Let's go for it. Let's ask Dr. Pinkos some questions.
Let me say hi to Dr. Pinkos. Welcome.
Hi.
She is now taping from Florida. I happen to be in San Juan right now, and Sandra happens to be in Washington, D.C., and that's what makes this synergy more exciting. Bueno, para empezar, to begin with, Margarita, simple but maybe not so simple question to begin, and that is understanding the concept of bilingual education. We hear English as a second language. We hear something called transitional bilingual education. We hear dual language, two-way, and we hear immersion. And it's confusing for the lay audience to understand all of this under one term called bilingual education. And sometimes we hear the term bilingual bicultural education. So can you help us understand and kind of dissect what is meant by the concept of bilingual education?
Well, it is not a simple question. It has lots of layers because I think that people like to put educational systems in silos and in uniform pieces, and the mind of people learning is not uniform and it's not isolated. So there's lots of layers to that. So I'm just going to say overall, because another term that you didn't mention was the LEP or ELL or ELS, and And that has been difficult to be able to define these children. So I'll start with the children because usually it's a safe place to start. In this country, we unfortunately, and I think in every country perhaps, we like to define people by the way, by what they cannot do instead of what they can do and their assets. And I think sometimes when we talk about asset-based instruction, we forget that it's not just to call something asset-based instruction if you don't do the actions and the practices that go with that. And part of that actions is these children have a level of proficiency in another language. And at some level, some of them are highly educated, some of them are just beginning their education in their native language, but they are, I think that a good friend of mine, Bernardo Garcia, in the state here in Florida, used to say that the only thing that an accent means is that that person is able to master another language at least as good as English. So the first one is, to me, I never get too involved in the issue of labels for kids. Their English language proficiency has been really passé because people feel that it is the focus on what they cannot do. English learners have some problems too, but at the end of the day, these are children that come to this country. They're not proficient completely in the English language, but they are proficient in theirs. And they need to be educated with the understanding that the language of instruction is not a language that they master. And that's the key. What is the language of instruction? How do we acquire knowledge? We acquire knowledge through language. And if we don't understand the language that the teacher and the student, they don't speak a common language, that you have to do certain things differently in order to meet their civil right of getting an education. So for many years, educators have come up with different models. I think that you mentioned some of your research, some of the original models that goes back to German, and even sometimes people say that even the founding fathers were not sure that English would be the language of the country. There were other languages that were thrown in, including Hebrew. So this is not new, but at that time, there was a different focus. I think that the current bilingual focus started in Miami when the masses of Cubans came in, and most of these Cubans were educated, and they wanted their children to be educated in both languages. So that comes back to the question of what does it mean bilingual education? So the term bilingual education explains any instruction that is done in a meaningful way, in a purposeful way, using one or more languages. Well, bilingual would be two languages, you can do multilingual. So, but it has to be, it's not that you're teaching the class and then suddenly you translate a word or something, or that you put the student aside. It is using both languages in a meaningful way and in a purposeful way. So that is the big umbrella. So under bilingual education, you have programs like dual language. A dual language is a program that contains either one-way immersion or two-way immersion. And there is a period of time of the day that is spent learning content in the native language and learning content in English. And there's different models, different amounts of time that you can do that. And what differentiates one-way immersion to two-way immersion is that in two-way immersion, you have native English speakers in the classroom at the same time. So they're both learning together language, so they're both exchanging and exploring a new language. So it's very important that the power base is kept at the same level between those two students, those two groups of students. One-way immersion is just that English language learners learn at a certain portion of the day in their native language and another portion of the day in English. And then the ESL, or English for Speakers of Other Languages, that's a program that would not fall into the bilingual education umbrella because the goal of that program is English proficiency exclusively. No question and no regards to the maintaining or keeping the native language. So those programs they may use in an assistive way the native language if it happens to be that the teacher or the educator speaks it. But at the end of the day, it is based on just the goal is English proficiency exclusively. I hope that clarifies it.
Abdeen, are you satisfied with Dr. Pinkos' response? I think I am. She was very detailed and to the point.
I remember Dr. Samuel Betances at one time, in fact, in a speech to the NABE conference several years ago, talked about bilingual education as understandable instruction. And if instruction is not understandable, regardless of language, then it's effete. So one of the things about bilingual education is that it's a way to transform literacy in a way that students do well as they understand what is being said and communicated. And so I think she covered the waterfront very, very well.
If you just tuned in, go ahead, Margarita.
That I didn't get into was culture, bicultural, because obviously language is the most important part of culture, and the way that, and it cannot be taught without an articulation between culture and language. But at the same time, we should be aiming for multicultural education, which this country is not a unicultural country. This country is the result of multiple cultures blending together, and that's what makes it so beautiful. So I think that, yes, of course, as it applies to language, we facilitate and we explore and we celebrate the language and the culture of the students that come in. But it's important to realize that, first of all, the students that come in don't have a monoculture. They come from different cultures within their own country. And so the idea of celebrating all cultures and learning how to learn from each other is very important. So I'm sorry, I forgot that part.
And one of the and it's interesting you say that, Margarita, because if you take away language, you hamper culture, and culture is transmitted best through language, and the best language is the native language. And so as we maximize biculturalism or multiculturalism, we enhance the language experience as well as the learning experience.
If you're just tuning in, we are Educa K16 podcast, and we're talking about bilingual education. And Dr. Pinkos has just informed us that any instruction done in a purposeful way, using two languages in a meaningful way, falls under that big umbrella of bilingual education. Dr. Pinkos, for our audience, can you please expand on the role of the National Association of Bilingual Education in bilingual education in the United States right now?
Well, NABE is an organization that has been around for 50 years. And if we look back at what the country looked like 50 years ago, it really leaves us with a lot of gratefulness to those people that originated and realized that there was a need and a vacuum in the country. That is the good part of the celebration. Unfortunately, the bad part is that we still are in an area of a vacuum too. We still have a very hard time understanding the concepts of bilingual education. And again, it's not the case. There was a time in this country that bilingual education came back. But it came back without a rigor, without a purpose, without any, just to put in language, and it cannot be like that. Education is a rigorous business, as we all know, and it has to be focused, and everything that we do has a purpose, has to have a purpose, an instructional purpose. And NABE offers that wealth of information. Most of NABE's attendees, we have an annual conference, and by the way, it's going to be in New York mid-February next year. And we bring together teachers and educators that are on the forefront of education. We bring together professors at the university. We bring together community members, even students, and parents. So this is a microcosm of people that are interested in bilingual education, exchanging ideas and checking each other out and understanding best practices. So NAVE offers that service, which I think is very powerful. The other service is that NAVE is at the forefront at the national level, working with the Department of Education in multiple administrations, as you can imagine, in 15 years. We have been able to adapt to different goals and different objectives of the national administration, and we have been able to continue to help them understand and focus on bilingualism as a strength and as an asset as they develop policies and as they develop strategies. So, again, that I think that kind of covers we also have publications, and we have 2 publications that people can look at, and we have documents that explore the different aspects of bilingual education.
Let me piggyback on what you said, Margarita, in terms of giving the audience an idea of how big is bilingual education in this country. Are we talking about a handful of schools? Are we talking about small populations of students? How big, how vast is bilingual education in the USA today?
Well, fortunately, not as vast as it should be, but it is. There is a new renaissance of districts that want to, because they see the results and they see, and many of parents see that their children are learning different languages and things like that. The backlash to that is that we have to be very alert, because as that has become a desirous program for middle-class parents, there has been a tendency for people, educators or policymakers, to exclude English language learners from the equation. And first of all, bilingual education is the best program if it's done correctly for English language learners. And that I think that anybody can understand that. It's also good for the other kids, and it's good to have both kids together. It makes a stronger program when you have the English language learners, because you have the models of language there, and vice versa. But there has been, we have to be very, and it's not common, but I think that it's because a lot of educators that are advocates have stood strong guarding those rails, but there is that tendency. But I would say that there are some districts that are like Miami-Dade. It's a mandate. Every one of the policies of the district is English plus native language plus 2. So many districts have reading 2 other languages, and some of the other districts have a limited program. So I'm also careful not to bunch all of these bilingual programs in one, because as much as I believe that any bilingualism included in the classroom is good for everybody, I think that there's a lot of programs that are not very strong out there, and we have to make sure that the basis of bilingual education are well understood and things are done with the program.
So if you're just tuning in, we're talking about, there are some students that are in the same classroom, they're English language learners, they might be in a monolingual setting, and they're not understanding or gathering the content that is being taught. So we're talking about a different model that gives hope and that teaches all students to either learn a new language, either English. English is the base language of instruction, like Dr. Pinkos mentioned, plus another language. It could be Spanish, which is the most common in our country, French, Arabic, any Chinese, Mandarin. There are many bilingual programs sprouting in our nation as a symbol of hope. If you just tuned in, we are Educa K16 podcast, and we're here talking with our bilingual education national expert, Dr. Margarita Pinkos. Take it away, Dr. Novoa.
Well, one of the other areas, and this may sound somewhat political or historical or both, is we're puzzled by the fact that even the early pioneers and pilgrims in this country spoke another language other than English. And at one point in the 1700s, as early as the 1700s, actually as early as the late 1600s, and throughout up until the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of debate about language. And there were even German schools in the 1800s and so forth, and that became a major force in this country. So bilingual education has been with us for a long time. We've just not really understood or known about some of that history. But what is puzzling and what becomes political is, why on earth is it taking so long for us to embrace, understand, and maximize on multiple languages and not fight another language other than English? When two is better than one and three is better than two. So what is it that we should know about that history? Why the resistance? Why the opposition? Why has it become so hard? Margarita, can you give us a little bit of a hint or perspective on what's going on or not going on, or what should be going on in this country, where it's become a debate rather than an embrace?
Yeah, it's a very complex and multi-layered problem. In those years that you talked about at the beginning of this nation, an educated person spoke another language. That was the definition of a cultured person, of an educated person. And that at some point, that has not necessarily been lost, but this country became, of all countries in the world, it shouldn't have been, but it became a monolingual country. And it's very hard to, even for kids that are bilingual, are multilingual, to practice the languages, because it's not something that is part of the nature of the country. And it doesn't even help when you travel, because it used to be a time in which those early Americans traveled and they had to be fluent in that language, and they're academically fluent in those languages. Nowadays, I mean, I'm a student of languages. I'm always learning German, Italian, French, whatever comes my way. And I go and I struggle with the language, and whoever it is in another country that I'm speaking to speaks in a beautiful English, and cuts me off, and which, with very good intent. But it's very easy. So many homes in America say, well, we don't need to speak another language because everybody speaks English. And that, unfortunately, is true. But at the same time, they don't realize that those people have the advantages of two languages, of using their brain in a bigger way, of understanding concepts in a bigger way. So the other part is that we miss out on is when we're having relationships, global relationships, and business relationships. Just speaking a few words and getting a translator doesn't cut it. You have to really be able to understand. In order to understand market opportunities, you have to really understand the culture and the language of those conversations. So we are to our detriment. We constantly handicap our children. And then the funny part is that we take so much effort in removing the language that those kids came with, particularly languages that are, and I would say that every language is critical to the security of this nation. And we take pains in making sure that they don't keep it. And then once they get to high school, we teach the language as a foreign language, or the Department of Defense or the Department of State has to spend a ton of money in teaching those people, when we all know that language learning is not easy, particularly as you become adult and if it's not done in content. So of course there is that whole area of ethocentrism, and as a principal, I would have people come to me and say, "You're just doing this," because I started a bilingual program in a rural area, and in that rural area there were the community was very divided by ethnicity and very divided by socioeconomic. And many people came to me and they would say, "You're just doing this to help your people." And many times I wish that I was anything but Hispanic, But I would say to them, "Oh no, this is not to help my people. The kids that are Hispanic, they already speak 2 languages. This is to help your child that only speaks 1." So that usually sometimes helps, but it has to be this idea, and we all say language is an asset. How many times do you hear it? Now you go to visit any administrator that I know of, any administrator, including me, that you go to visit, and I didn't have my degrees because I never liked that. But most educators have some kind of their experience in their office, some kind of their degrees or their awards or all that. You never see a sign in an office that says, "I am bilingual. I speak 2 languages." And people don't celebrate that. So again, and I have to say, politically, sometimes it's more accepted to speak some of the European languages than some of the native languages, and that is part of the ethnocentrism and the political realities of our country.
And it's interesting, Margarita, and I was looking at some statistics not long ago, and I was impressed by the fact that half the world speaks 2 or more languages. And then reflecting back on the U.S., which has the highest educational rate worldwide as a nation, it just seemed incongruous. And I must add one more item, only because I'm now in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and that is that Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And in Puerto Rico, the language of government, of communication, of media, of everyday life is Spanish. And so as much as we say we are bilingual, it's predominantly Spanish, and we are U.S. citizens. So we have more than 3 million Americans who speak principally Spanish in a U.S. territory, Commonwealth called Puerto Rico. So when they migrate to and from the United States, they have every right to continue the dual language experience that they come from. And so I needed to add that, and that's not a political statement. That is the reality of America 2021 right now.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that and what Dr. Pinkos said, in the U.S., there is no official language, although we know English is the language that, is used mostly by everyone, but it is not an official language. So I say we continue to talk about bilingual education. I'm biased for dual language immersion programs. I love them. I've worked in them, and I've seen the progress of the critical thinking in students and just how it elevates, their understanding of content. But I want to continue to ask questions, if it's okay. Dr. Pinkos, one more?
Let me just clarify something that has to do with what you just said. Yes, the English is not we don't have a national language, but there's many states that have stated that the English is the official language of the state and so on. And sometimes educators use that as an area of fear or the decision making, and we cannot have it to a language program. And that's not what that means. What if the state chooses English as an official language, it doesn't affect. You can still have a dual language program because English is taught in every and the proficiency. I mean, I was once told, and I think it's very true, that if our job was to prevent them from learning English, we would fail. English is just so embedded into everything that we do. So we aim for mastery in both languages, particularly in English. And in the other language too. So it has never been the promise or the objective that students would not learn English. On the contrary, in dual language programs, they understand how the language works better than when there is no other language involved. They're able to see their language in a compare and contrast way when you're looking at other languages. So actually, those kids are more proficient than English only. So those laws, because I think sometimes educators get confused with that.
That's a great clarification because it prevents people from moving forward in starting our bilingual programs in their schools or starting charter schools, etc. So that's a great clarification. How do we know that bilingual education works? Like, let's choose like the dual language model, for example, a dual language immersion program. What should we know about its efficacy? I know there's a lot, but can you hone in on some of the components?
Well, before I do that, I usually say, particularly for non-educators, but even for educators too, and I say, if you are the owner of a big international company, that your money depends on how you sell your product. So you decide to open an office, let's say in France, and your head finance person doesn't speak French, but you need that person to be there in the country, managing your business, managing the finances, managing the labor laws, managing all of that. Now, of course, they have to learn the labor laws of the country. They have to learn. There's a lot of learning that would go on if you want to have a good business, right? So I always say to even business people, and I say, so if that is happening, what language would you train your people, the people that you're paying a ton of money to be there, what language would you teach them in? And they always say, well, in English. You can't teach them in French. I mean, obviously, they have to learn French, and they have to practice French. But if nobody's going to spend, no businessman is going to spend money in teaching their staff something that they don't understand what is being taught. So if this makes so much sense to the common person, why wouldn't it make sense as educators? So when kids come to us, I mean, I always say that the lower grades are critical, particularly if you have a two-way immersion. We talk about what usually we refer to as a 50-50 model, 50% of the time in English, 50% of the time in whatever language you're targeting. But that's not true. There's no 50-50. That's 50% of the time in school. That's not even taken into consideration unless you do it on purpose. All of the classes of music and all of that, the cafeteria and all of that. So unless you're living in Miami, which is one of the few places in which you're not exposed to another language once you leave the school site. So there is no time to explore languages. So when we say 50-50, it's not really 50-50. So that's why educators need to take as much opportunity in the lower grades to make sure that the monolingual English speakers get bombarded with language so that they are able to grasp those concepts. So basically what happens in a dual language program is when you're in the English side, which you're very familiar with that because that's how education is in most places, you teach in a very very pedagogically sound way, which you have to make comprehensible instruction when you're teaching in English to a mixed group of students that are proficient in English and proficient in another language. You teach in English. When you go to then half of the day, and you decide as teachers what subjects you're going to teach in one language or the other. Then the students, the teachers switch, and then the same group of students goes to another classroom, and they learn it in the target language. In most programs, it's in Spanish, but we have it in many languages. So at that time, the structure of power changes, and the student that did not understand very well and was struggling with language suddenly becomes the helper to help the other students. So it changes the power, but it also changes the ability to use different words to explain different things. So I like that the purity of a language like that. To do it at the 50-50 for very practical reasons. It's very cheap to do it. If you're doing it like that, you only need 2 teachers for X number of students. But the one thing that I insist on, and many other people don't believe that, but I do. Language arts has to be taught in both languages. I believe that there are some nuances of languages, that the beauty of the literature of the language, and the beauty of understanding the whys of how language is developed and spoken, have to be taught. And there is a different way to teach English than to teach early literacy in English, and it's very different to teach it in Arabic or in Spanish or in French. So whenever I've made a recommendation, I would say you have to teach both sides. You have to teach the language arts. Now, the other subjects, I really don't care, because if it is a good teacher and really understands well how to teach it and how to make it comprehensible, the students are going to learn. And I have a good example. There was a school in this district in Palm Beach County that decided to teach, and I always let the teachers make a decision. You might have in your team a teacher that is a very good science teacher and happens to be Spanish. You definitely say, we're going to teach science in Spanish or whatever other languages you teach. So you take advantage of the strength of the teacher. So that's why I always feel that people should have the flexibility of choosing. So, of course, that creates problems with instructional materials and all of that. That I'm not going to discount that. So in this school, they were teaching science in Spanish exclusively. And that was the first year that we had the Florida assessment of science in every school. Obviously, that principal was a little scared, but she stuck to her decision. Monolingual English speaker, a principal. When the scores came, those students, the monolingual English speaking kids, score above the district average, and they had never been taught in English, and the test was in English, and they overscored by 20 points, and that was a significant point. And the English learners that were in that class surpassed all of the other English learners in the science test. So, I mean, I have graphs, and I always share it with people, because people always, the big thing that you always get is, well, the test is in English. Well, it doesn't matter. The test tests a comprehensive way of thinking, and you mentioned critical thinking, of all of that. So if you're able to at least decode and understand and be able to read in English, you're going to be able to pour all that language, doesn't matter how. And I think that and the other way is, there's the academic English is based on a lot of cognates that are based on Romance languages. So for a student that, I mean, I used to have a teacher that came to me advocating for bilingual education, and she says, but wouldn't it be great if we were able to say to the kids, I don't know, like a word like atmosphere. How do you say atmosphere in Spanish? And I said, atmósfera. So then she says, well, I'm sorry, that's not a good one. Let's just say perpendicular. And I said perpendicular. So, I mean, so each word is not based on a cognate. And that's not, well, so I think that's why bilingual children score so high in SAT, because the SAT focuses on very academic words that speaking another language, even if you don't know what the word means, you kind of get a feeling for the word if you speak another language. So that's...
You've mentioned a lot of things, and thank you so much, because those cognates just took me back to my 5th grade class with my charts of cognates and science all over the wall. You know, transfer of information is key, right? So if you learn it in one language, it's going to transfer to the other language, so you don't have to teach it twice. Exactly. It's something that happens automatically also. Abdeen, close it up for us.
Of the cognates, in that a good portion of English is based on the Romantic languages, and Spanish comes in loud and clear in that respect. And years ago, a friend of mine put together a number of cognate words, like words ending in A-T-I-O-N, Asian becoming nación, where they are spelled almost identically all the time. And just that one rule of thumb covers 750 words. One rule of thumb. So if you put there are about 47 rules of thumb like that. You put them all together, you can transliterate almost 3,000 words from language 1 to language 2 when it comes to Spanish, English, English, Spanish. That's fascinating. So that transfer skill is major for a lot of us.
Right, but also there's a cognitive load there that is acquired when you're able to transfer across languages, that you don't even realize that you're doing it.
That's right.
That is a cognitive ability that highlights that in the brain. There have been all kinds of research done on the brain, and even that it delays dementia and things like that. And I think it is because it reaches different parts of the brain. It keeps the brain lit, for lack of a better word. Now, the other part that I think it's important to recognize in the lower levels is English is a hard language. It's a hard language to learn how to read and how to decode. It's just, I used to say to my kids, hey guys, read and read are spelled the same way. So don't try to figure it out, So English is, and there's a lot of reading difficulties in young children in English. We don't have in some of the Romance languages. I don't know enough about Asian languages or Arabic language, Arabic-based languages, but I know that the Romantic languages are very reliable. One syllable means the same thing always. One word means that. So many children that have learning disabilities are able to. They don't know what they're reading yet because they haven't been taught. But in the lower grades, they're able. I saw that over and over again. They were able to learn how to decode in Spanish, even though they were native English speakers. They were able to learn how to decode in Spanish before they learned how to decode in English, and that knowledge helped them make sense a little bit of making sense of the words in English. And there was a study done a while ago that showed the incidence of learning disabilities in Italy and in France and in Spain were minimal compared to the learning disabilities of this one. And I think part of that is the difficulty of the language itself, that it doesn't have a lot of reliability between sounds and a lot of so there's some issues with the language itself. That adds to the beauty of the language, but it adds to the difficulty of learning it even for the native speaker.
It's interesting. English is a very difficult language because it's inconsistent, and it's inconsistent because it's a mongrel language. So half of it is based on Romance languages, and half of it is based on Anglo-Saxon. But when you put them all together, it's a mess. And if students do not understand that, they have difficulty. Once you partial it out, it becomes a lot easier. And literacy difficulties are minimized for students who know that and can decode. And so having the access of another language actually facilitates English learning. And that's fascinating.
The bottom line is that we all need to belong, right? And build positive relationships in our journey schooling from, pre-K all the way through. Educa K16 podcast is a call to action to raise awareness about education in our nation. Today you heard from Dr. Pinkos on bilingual education in our nation as we bring to life the books written by my co-host, Dr. Abdignoboa Rios, Latinos in Education in American History and the Critical Issues We Face in the 21st Century. Dr. Noboa has written all of these books, and we are distilling this information in our podcast, bringing to life interviews to then create this momentum of a renaissance in our education system. Please go and listen to the podcast you've missed on Spotify or Anchor, or visit our Educa K16 YouTube channel to put faces to names. Stay tuned next week as we continue the conversation on education. Thank you, Dr. Margarita Pinkos, Dr. Abdignoboa Rios. Thank you for being here with us. Some last words, tie it all in, Dr. Noboa?
Not easily, but we have hit a lot of topics within one topic. And I think there's been a lot of learning, a lot of sharing throughout in terms of the competency of language, the meaning of language, and the importance of language. looked at from multiple perspectives. And what intrigued me, in terms of what Dr. Pinkos said, among many other things that she said, is the bicognitive aspect, that we're now getting some interesting research as of the past 20 years in terms of what some people have called the bilingual brain. And the bilingual brain works differently and more effectively than the monolingual brain. And we have yet to hear more about that research in the future. But it's a whole area that we did not know about years ago. And again, it feeds into the competency of the importance of thinking beyond monolingualism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Pinkos, one last push for understanding.
I'd say the only thing that I would add is purpose. It's very hard to get kids excited about learning languages. We have not created a narrative of why. And, nobody grows up thinking that they want to be a French speaker or a Spanish speaker. Nobody says that. You ask a child, what do you want to be when you grow up? They never say that. They want to say an engineer, a doctor, a teacher. So let's just begin to think about doing career education within a bilingual format so that as they become strong in understanding those different areas that they're interested in, they're able to, at the same time, learn the language, because it will be through content, which is the best way to learn language anyway. So those are my last comments.
Thank you so much. Stay tuned next week, listeners, as we continue the conversation on education.
This has been good. Thank you, Margarita. Pleasure.
Thank you.